The mahogany boardroom was so quiet you could hear a dynasty shatter. Alistair Sterling's knuckles turned bone white as he gripped the edge of the table, his eyes locked on the mousy woman sitting in the corner. For 5 years, he had treated her like the dirt on his bespoke Italian leather loafers. To him, she was just the hired help, an invisible nobody who filed papers and fetched his uncle's tea. But as the senior partner read the final lines of the 80-page document, the brutal truth echoed through the room. This worthless nobody now owned everything. To the outside world, Arthur Sterling was a titan. He was a man who had built a telecommunications and real estate empire from the ground up, dominating the Manhattan skyline and securing a legacy that rivaled the old money of the Astors and the Vanderbilts. But to Nora Hayes, he was just a lonely, sharp-witted old man who preferred the quiet company of dusty first editions to the sycophantic chatter of his own blood relatives. Nora was 28, possessing a quiet, unassuming demeanor that made her easily forgettable to the ultra-wealthy individuals who frequented the Sterling estate in Newport, Rhode Island. She had been hired 5 years ago as an archivist and personal assistant to organize Arthur's sprawling, chaotic library and manage his private correspondence. Her background was modest, a degree in history, a mountain of student debt, and a resume that included a stint at the Newport Historical Society. She wore practical cardigans, kept her brown hair tied back in a simple clip, and spoke only when spoken to. Alistair Sterling, Arthur's 34-year-old nephew, saw Nora as part of the furniture. If he noticed her at all, it was only to issue a sharp demand or to roll his eyes at her presence. Alistair was the heir apparent, the senior vice president of acquisitions at Sterling Enterprises. He wore Tom Ford suits, drove a silver Aston Martin, and possessed a sense of entitlement so dense it had its own gravitational pull. "You, girl," Alistair snapped one rainy Tuesday afternoon, striding into the sprawling library of the Newport estate without knocking. He didn't even bother to look at Nora, who was perched on a rolling ladder, carefully cataloguing a collection of 19th-century maritime maps. "Where is my uncle? I have a board meeting in 3 hours at the Cravath, Swain and Moore offices, and I need his signature on the proxy forms." Nora carefully placed a map back onto the mahogany shelf before descending the ladder. "Mr. Sterling is resting in the sunroom, Alistair. His physician advised against disturbing him before noon." Alistair let out a harsh, derisive bark of laughter. "I don't care what his overpriced quack of a doctor says, and it's Mr. Sterling to you. Do not address me by my first name like we are peers. We are not. You fetch books. I run a Fortune 500 company. Now get out of my way." He brushed past her, his shoulder clipping hers hard enough to make her stumble. Nora didn't say a word. She merely adjusted her cardigan, watched him storm down the hallway, and then quietly picked up the proxy forms he had dropped on the floor. This was the dynamic. Alistair was the sun around which the Sterling Empire was expected to orbit, and Nora was an invisible speck of dust. What Alistair didn't know, what no one in the family knew, was that Arthur Sterling was not nearly as blind or as senile as they hoped. Behind closed doors, Arthur and Nora spent hours talking. They didn't just talk about books. They talked about human nature, about business ethics, and about the crushing weight of legacy. Arthur would often sit in his wingback chair, his frail hands resting on his cane, watching his nephew from the window with cold, calculating eyes. "Look at him, Nora," Arthur murmured one evening, as Alistair's sports car peeled out of the gravel driveway, leaving deep, destructive ruts in the manicured lawn. "He knows the price of everything and the value of absolutely nothing. He thinks this empire is a birthright, an ATM meant to fund his vanity projects and his ego." "He is your nephew, sir?" Nora replied softly, pouring a cup of Earl Grey tea and placing it gently on the side table beside him. "Blood is an accident of geography, my dear," Arthur rasped, taking the teacup with a trembling hand. "Character is a choice. A man who treats the people beneath him like garbage will eventually turn his kingdom into a landfill." He looked up at her, his sharp blue eyes piercing through the dim lighting of the library. "You see everything, don't you, Nora? You sit in the corner, you take notes, and you never ask for a damn thing." "I have everything I need, Mr. Sterling. The work is fulfilling." Arthur chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "You are entirely too humble, but humility is a dangerous thing in a world full of wolves. Remember that." In the final months of Arthur's life, his health deteriorated rapidly. The grand house in Newport became a revolving door of medical specialists, palliative care nurses, and increasingly anxious relatives circling like sharks sensing blood in the water. Alistair began practically living at the estate, though he rarely spent more than 5 minutes in his uncle's room. Instead, he spent his time pacing the grand hallways on his phone, loudly barking orders to his underlings, pre-planning renovations for the house he already considered his own. During this time, Nora became Arthur's sole confidant. She fed him when he was too weak to lift a spoon, read him his favorite passages from Marcus Aurelius, and held his hand during the long, painful nights. Alistair, noticing Nora's constant presence, confronted her in the hallway one evening, his breath smelling faintly of expensive scotch. "Listen to me very carefully, little mouse," Alistair sneered, backing her against the expensive silk wallpaper. "The second the old man flatlines, you are out on the street. Don't think for a second that playing nursemaid is going to earn you a spot in the will. I've already instructed HR to terminate your contract the minute his heart stops. So enjoy the view while it lasts." Nora looked at him, her expression completely unreadable. "My employment contract is with Mr. Sterling, not with you." "I am Mr. Sterling," Alistair spat, his eyes dark with malice. "You're just a glorified maid. Remember your place." 3 days later, Arthur Sterling passed away quietly in his sleep. Nora was the one sitting beside him, holding his cold hand. Alistair was in Manhattan, attending a gala. The funeral of Arthur Sterling was less a mourning of a lost life, and more a high society networking event. Held at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, it was packed with politicians, Wall Street tycoons, and socialites dressed in somber, yet impeccably tailored black designer clothing. The media thronged the steps outside, cameras flashing as Alistair played the role of the grieving heir to perfection, dabbing his dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief for the press. Nora sat in the very back pew, far away from the cordoned-off VIP section. She wore a simple black dress she had bought off the rack 3 years ago. She didn't cry, not because she wasn't devastated, but because her grief felt too private, too sacred, to display in a room full of people who were mentally dividing up the man's assets while his casket was still above ground. Following the burial, the family immediately shifted gears. The mourning period officially ended the moment the dirt hit the mahogany casket. The very next morning, the primary family members received summons from the elite Manhattan law firm of Caldwell, Harmon, and Smith. Benjamin Caldwell, the senior partner and Arthur's personal attorney for over 40 years, was a formidable man. He was old school, rigid, and entirely immune to the bullying tactics of men like Alistair. When Nora received the heavy, cream-colored envelope bearing the law firm's crest in the morning mail at the Newport estate, she assumed it was a formal notice of her termination and eviction. She was currently packing her meager belongings into cardboard boxes in her small room above the carriage house. Alistair had made good on his promise. He had sent a security guard to her door at 6 a.m., giving her exactly 48 hours to vacate the premises. She opened the envelope with a sigh, expecting legalese about severance. Instead, she found a formal summons. Ms. Nora Hayes, you are hereby required to attend the formal reading of the last will and testament of Arthur Sterling. Your presence is strictly mandated by the deceased. Nora stared at the paper, her heart giving a strange flutter. Why would she be invited? Perhaps Arthur had left her a small token of appreciation, a few $1,000s to help her land on her feet, or perhaps one of the rare books she loved so much. The next afternoon, Nora walked into the towering glass and steel skyscraper on Park Avenue. The lobby was intimidating, all imported marble and aggressive security. She took the express elevator to the 50th floor, the doors opening to a reception area that felt more like a modern art museum than a law firm. She was ushered into a massive oak-paneled boardroom. The room was already heavily populated. There was Beatrice Sterling, Arthur's younger sister, an aging socialite dripping in diamonds, who had spent her life complaining about her brother's frugality. There was Gregory, a distant cousin who ran a failing tech startup and was desperate for a cash injection. And, presiding at the head of the table like a king on a throne, was Alistair. When Nora stepped quietly through the double doors, the room fell silent. Alistair's head snapped up, his eyes narrowed, burning with immediate visceral anger. He slammed his hand on the polished table. "What is she doing here?" he demanded, pointing a manicured finger at Nora. Benjamin Caldwell, standing at the head of the table, sorting through a thick stack of documents, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. "Miss Hayes is here because she is named in the will, Alistair. Please sit down." "This is outrageous," Alistair sneered, standing up. "She's the hired help, a secretary. What did the old man do? Leave her a tea set? Give her her little parting gift in the lobby and get her out of here? This is a private family matter." "Mr. Sterling," Caldwell's voice dropped an octave, resonating with absolute authority. "If you do not sit down and remain quiet, I will have security remove you from this building, and you will learn of your inheritance via certified mail. The deceased left very specific instructions regarding who is to be present in this room. Ms. Hayes's attendance is non-negotiable." Alistair clenched his jaw, a vein pulsing in his temple. He shot Nora a look of pure, unadulterated venom. "Fine. Let the maid watch. But if she expects a payout, she's going to be very disappointed. I'm having my own lawyers contest any ridiculous charity donations Arthur made while he was out of his mind on painkillers." Nora quietly took a seat in the back corner of the room, as far away from the mahogany table as possible. She folded her hands in her lap, her face a mask of calm, though her stomach was tied in knots. She felt entirely out of place, a sparrow surrounded by hawks. "Let us begin," Caldwell said, taking his seat and opening the thick, leather-bound folder. The reading began with the predictable drudgery of a billionaire's estate. It was a labyrinth of trusts, tax-sheltered accounts, and minor bequests to various charities and institutions. Arthur had been generous to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and to the New York Public Library. With every $1 million allocated to an institution, Alistair's posture grew more rigid. He was doing the math in his head, watching chunks of what he considered his money slip away to causes he despised. "To my sister Beatrice," Caldwell read, his voice dry and steady. "I leave the sum of $5 million, placed in an irrevocable trust, distributed in monthly stipends to ensure she does not squander it on a fourth husband." Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her pearls. "How dare he? A stipend? Like a child?" "Moving on," Caldwell said, completely ignoring her outrage. "To my cousin Gregory, I leave the hunting lodge in Montana and a one-time cash sum of $2 million. I advise you to pay off your debts, Gregory, rather than funding another useless app." Gregory slumped in his chair, looking both relieved and insulted. Alistair was practically vibrating with anticipation. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. The minor players had been dealt with. It was time for the main event. The controlling shares of Sterling Enterprises, the global real estate portfolio, the liquid assets, and the crown jewel, the Newport estate. Caldwell paused. He took a sip of water, turned a page, and looked over the top of his glasses at the room. The silence was suffocating. "We now come to the bulk of the estate," Caldwell announced. "This pertains to the 74% controlling interest in Sterling Enterprises, the liquid capital held in offshore and domestic accounts totaling roughly $1.2 billion, and all personal real estate, including the primary residence in Newport." Alistair smirked, leaning back and crossing his arms. He shot a triumphant look around the room, making a point to lock eyes with Nora in the corner. "Watch and learn," his eyes seemed to say. Caldwell cleared his throat. "The deceased's instructions are as follows. To my nephew, Alistair Sterling." Alistair closed his eyes, savouring the moment. "I leave the sum of $100,000. The room went dead. A vacuum of sound. Alistair opened his eyes. He let out a strange, breathless laugh. "I'm sorry, Benjamin. I think you misread that. You missed a few zeros." "I read it exactly as it is written," Caldwell replied smoothly. $100,000. Furthermore, the will states, Alistair is to be immediately stripped of his title as Senior Vice President of Acquisitions at Sterling Enterprises, effectively immediately upon my death, with no severance package, as he has used company funds for personal enrichment for the last 3 years. A fact my auditors have meticulously documented. "This is a joke," Alistair shouted, leaping to his feet, his chair crashing backward onto the marble floor. "This is a sick, twisted joke." He was senile. He was out of his mind. "He was entirely of sound mind, Alistair," Caldwell said sharply. 4 independent psychiatrists signed off on his cognitive abilities the day this document was drafted, 3 weeks before his passing. "Then who gets it?" Alistair roared, slamming his fists on the table, his face purple with rage. "Who gets my company?" Caldwell did not flinch. He slowly turned his gaze toward the corner of the room. Every head in the boardroom followed his stare, turning to look at the quiet woman in the modest black dress. "The entirety of the remaining estate," Caldwell read, his voice ringing loud and clear across the cavernous room, "including the controlling shares of Sterling Enterprises, the liquid assets, and the Newport estate, is left to Ms. Nora Hayes." For a full 10 seconds, nobody breathed. Nora felt the blood drain from her face. The room started to spin. She gripped the edges of her chair, her knuckles turning white. Billion? Controlling interest? The Newport estate? It was impossible. It was a mistake. She was just the archivist. "Her!" Alistair screamed, the sound tearing through his throat. He pointed at Nora, his hand shaking violently. "You're giving the empire to the damn maid. She's a nobody. She's worthless. She probably slept with him. She manipulated a dying old man." "Mr. Sterling, control yourself," Caldwell barked, "or I will have you removed by force." "I'll sue," Alistair spat, practically leaping over the table. "I will tie this up in probate court for the next 20 years. I will destroy her. You hear me, you little rat? I will bury you in legal fees until you are begging to work the drive-through at a fast food joint." "You will find that very difficult to do, Alistair," Caldwell said calmly, pulling a smaller sealed envelope from the back of the folder. "Arthur anticipated your emotional response. He left a personal letter to be read aloud immediately following the disclosure of the primary beneficiary." Caldwell broke the wax seal on the envelope. Nora sat frozen. The venom radiating from Alistair was palpable, almost physical, But underneath the terror, a strange, profound shock was anchoring her to the chair. Arthur had given her everything. Why? Caldwell unfolded the heavy parchment paper and began to read Arthur's final words. To my family, and particularly to my nephew, Alistair. If you are hearing this, it means Benjamin has just dropped a bomb on your expectations. I can imagine the shouting. I can picture Alistair threatening to sue. Let me save you the legal fees. I have spent the last 5 years quietly liquidating hidden assets and establishing an impenetrable legal fortress around Nora's inheritance. You cannot touch it. You cannot contest it. Any attempt to sue will trigger a secondary clause that will publish the forensic accounting of Alistair's corporate embezzlement to the SEC and the New York Times. Alistair froze, the color completely draining from his face. He looked as though he had been struck by lightning. Alistair, you thought Nora was worthless because she did not possess a title, a trust fund, or an arrogant disposition. Caldwell continued reading. You judged her by her quietness, assuming it meant weakness. You were wrong. For 5 years I tested her. I tested her integrity, her intelligence, and her character. She passed every test, while you failed yours miserably. The Empire requires a steward who understands the value of hard work, humility, and foresight. It does not require a tyrant. Caldwell paused, looking directly at Nora. His usually stern face softened just a fraction. Nora, my dear, the letter concluded. I am sorry to place this heavy crown upon your head, but I know you are the only one strong enough to bear it. Do not let them intimidate you. The wolves will circle, but remember, you own the forest now. The boardroom was entirely silent once again, but this time the silence was different. It was the sound of a power dynamic shifting so violently the aftershocks could be felt in the very foundation of the room. Alistair stood frozen, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and unbridled hatred. He looked at Nora, truly looking at her for the first time in 5 years. She wasn't the invisible archivist anymore. Nora slowly stood up from her chair in the corner. Her legs were trembling, but she forced herself to stand tall. She met Alistair's furious gaze, and for the first time since she had met him, she did not look away. The transition from a cramped room above the carriage house to the master suite of the Newport estate was a surreal, dizzying experience for Nora. Over the course of 48 hours, she had gone from calculating whether she could afford to repair the transmission on her 10-year-old Honda Civic to being the primary client of J.P. Morgan's private bank division. Benjamin Caldwell had not exaggerated the ironclad nature of Arthur's legal maneuvering. The trust was entirely bulletproof. By Monday morning, the news had leaked to the press, and the media frenzy was instantaneous. Helicopters from local news stations hovered over the estate, and reporters camped outside the wrought iron gates, clamoring for a shot of the Cinderella billionaire. Inside the house, however, there was no fairy tale. There was only a suffocating tension and a mountain of corporate briefings. "They're going to try to crush you, Ms. Hayes," Caldwell advised her, as they sat in the sprawling, formal dining room, the table covered in financial reports. Beside him sat Harrison Cole, the veteran chief operating officer of Sterling Enterprises. Harrison was a pragmatist in his late 50s, a man who had tolerated Alistair's tantrums only out of loyalty to Arthur. "Alistair is currently rallying the board of directors," Harrison added, adjusting his reading glasses. "He still has allies, men who benefited from his lax oversight. They are planning to call an emergency meeting to vote no confidence in your leadership before you even officially take the CEO chair. They want to install Alistair as interim CEO, citing your lack of corporate experience." Nora stared at the spread of documents. She felt a wave of imposter syndrome threatening to pull her under. She was an archivist, a historian. How was she supposed to run a telecommunications and real estate conglomerate worth billions? "What happens if they pass the vote?" Nora asked, her voice steady despite the anxiety gnawing at her stomach. "If they pass it, they essentially freeze your executive power," Harrison explained grimly. "You would still own the 74% controlling interest, but the board would argue fiduciary duty to the minority shareholders to keep you out of operations. It would tie the company up in litigation for years, during which time Alistair would bleed the assets dry." Nora looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows toward the crashing waves of the Atlantic. She remembered Arthur's words from the letter. "The Empire requires a steward who understands the value of hard work, humility, and foresight. I tested her." She hadn't realized she was being tested, but as she thought back to the endless conversations in the library, she remembered the specific documents Arthur had asked her to cross-reference. "Harrison," Nora said, turning back to the table. 2 months ago, Arthur asked me to pull the historical zoning permits and environmental impact reports for the waterfront properties in the Tribeca district. He also asked me to compile the shell company registrations connected to a firm called Apex Development. Harrison frowned, exchanging a quick look with Caldwell. "Apex? That's a boutique real estate firm. Alistair pushed hard for Sterling Enterprises to acquire them last quarter, but Arthur vetoed it. He said the numbers didn't make sense." "Arthur vetoed it because it was a scam," Nora said, standing up and walking toward the library. The 2 men followed her. She went straight to a locked filing cabinet in the corner, producing a small brass key from her pocket, a key Arthur had given her the week before he died. She opened the drawer and pulled out a thick, red-tabbed folder. She dropped it on the heavy oak desk. "Alistair isn't just incompetent. He is deeply compromised," Nora stated, her tone shifting from uncertain to sharp. "Apex Development is secretly owned by an offshore holding company in the Cayman Islands, a holding company registered to Alistair's college roommate. Alistair was trying to use Sterling Enterprises capital to buy a worthless company at a massive premium, effectively funneling $50 million of shareholder money directly into his own pockets." Harrison flipped through the documents, his eyes widening as he traced the paper trail Nora and Arthur had meticulously mapped out. "Good God," he whispered. "This is wire fraud. It's corporate embezzlement on a massive scale. If the SEC sees this—" "They won't," Nora said quietly. "Not yet. If we drop this on him now, the resulting scandal will tank Sterling Enterprises' stock price by 30%. The shareholders will panic. Arthur spent his life building this company. I am not going to let Alistair's greed destroy its reputation on my first day." "Then what is your play, Nora?" Caldwell asked, a hint of genuine respect coloring his tone. "We let him call the emergency board meeting," Nora replied, her brown eyes hardening. "We let him walk into the room thinking he has the upper hand. And then we cut the strings." Across the city in Manhattan, Alistair was operating in a state of manic rage. He had set up a war room in his penthouse overlooking Central Park, surrounded by aggressive corporate litigators from Skadden, ARPS, and crisis PR managers. "She's a gold digger who manipulated a dying man with dementia," Alistair barked into his phone, pacing the hardwood floors. He was speaking to a prominent financial journalist at the Wall Street Journal. "Yes, you can quote an anonymous source close to the family. She doesn't know the difference between a hedge fund and a hedge maze. The board will remove her by Friday." He hung up, downing the rest of his bourbon. He looked at his reflection in the glass window. He was a Sterling. He was bred for this, No mousy little librarian was going to steal his birthright. He had already secured the votes of 4 of the 7 board members. They were greedy, malleable men who knew Alistair would sign off on their exorbitant executive bonuses. All he had to do was humiliate her in front of the board, prove her incompetence, and the empire would be back in his hands. Friday morning arrived with torrential rain, casting a grey, oppressive pall over Manhattan. The boardroom at Sterling Enterprises' global headquarters on the 60th floor was a theatre of war. The 7 members of the board of directors were seated around a massive glass table. Alistair sat at the far end, looking immaculate in a charcoal bespoke suit, a smirk playing on his lips. He was in his element, holding court, cracking jokes with the men he had bribed and bullied into his corner. At exactly 9 a.m., the heavy oak doors opened. The room expected the timid, cardigan-wearing archivist who used to fetch Arthur's coffee. Instead, Nora Hayes walked in, looking like an entirely different species. She wore a sharply tailored, deep navy Saint Laurent suit that armored her in corporate authority. Her hair was pulled back into a sleek, unforgiving twist, and her expression was as cold and unreadable as Arthur Sterling's used to be. She was flanked by Benjamin Caldwell and Harrison Cole. The low murmur of conversation in the room instantly died. Alistair's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly recovered, leaning back in his chair. "Ms. Hayes, how kind of you to join us. I hope you didn't get lost on the way up to the executive floors." Nora ignored the jab entirely. She walked to the head of the table, the seat that had belonged to Arthur, and set her leather briefcase down. She did not sit. "Let us dispense with the pleasantries," Nora said, her voice projecting effortlessly across the room. "I am aware of why this emergency meeting was called. A motion of no confidence against my ascension to Chief Executive Officer." "It's nothing personal, Nora," said Thomas Croft, a board member and close ally of Alistair's, offering a patronizing smile. "We simply have a fiduciary duty to our shareholders. You have 0 executive experience. Running a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate is not like organizing library books. We need a steady, experienced hand at the wheel. Alistair knows the operations inside and out." "Does he?" Nora asked, raising a single eyebrow. She opened her briefcase. "Let's talk about Alistair's operations. Let's talk about the proposed acquisition of Apex Development." Alistair's posture stiffened. "That deal is dead. Arthur killed it. It's irrelevant to this meeting." "It is highly relevant to your judgment," Nora countered smoothly, pulling a stack of sleek, black folders from her case and sliding one to each board member. "As well as your integrity." The board members opened the folders. "What you are looking at," Nora explained, pacing slowly behind her chair, "is a forensic financial trace of Apex Development. You will see that Apex holds no actual physical assets. It is a shell company. Turn to page 4, and you will find the incorporation documents from the Cayman Islands, listing the primary beneficiary as one David L. Montgomery." Alistair went pale. The smirk vanished completely. "David Montgomery," Nora continued, her voice perfectly level, "was Alistair's roommate at Yale. Furthermore, the routing numbers for Apex's holding accounts directly match a series of offshore accounts that have been quietly receiving consulting fees from Sterling Enterprises for the last 3 years. Fees authorized solely by Alistair. "This is fabricated garbage," Alistair shouted, slamming his hand on the table, though his voice cracked slightly. "She doctored these. She's trying to frame me to save her own skin." "The IP addresses authorizing the transfers came directly from your private terminal in this very building, Alistair," Harrison Cole chimed in from the side of the room, adjusting his glasses. "The IT department confirmed it yesterday afternoon, under my direct orders." The board members were suddenly very quiet. The men who had been joking with Alistair 5 minutes prior were now staring at the documents as if they were venomous snakes. It was one thing to overlook a bit of nepotism. It was quite another to be an accessory to a $50 million wire fraud scheme. "If this goes to the SEC," Thomas Croft whispered, his face ashen, "it will destroy the stock. It will destroy all of us." "Exactly," Nora said, finally taking her seat at the head of the table. She folded her hands, looking down the length of the glass at Alistair, who was staring at her with pure, suffocating terror. "Here is the reality of the situation," Nora told the room, her tone leaving zero room for negotiation. "I am not releasing this to the SEC. I am keeping it entirely in-house. Sterling Enterprises will not suffer a public scandal because of the greed of one man." She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Alistair. "However, in exchange for my silence, Alistair, you are going to resign from the board of directors, effective immediately. You will sign over your remaining non-voting shares to the corporate treasury. You will walk out of this building today, and you will never set foot in a Sterling Enterprise office again." "You can't do this!" Alistair hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and panic. "I am a Sterling. My name is on the building." "Your uncle's name is on the building," Nora corrected coldly, "and he entrusted it to me. You have 30 seconds to sign the resignation papers Mr. Caldwell has prepared, or I hit send on an email containing these documents to the Department of Justice." Caldwell slid a single piece of paper and a Mont Blanc pen across the table toward Alistair. The silence in the room was absolute. The board members watched in stunned fascination as Alistair Sterling, the golden boy of Manhattan real estate, looked down at the paper. His hands were shaking. He looked at his allies, but Thomas Croft and the others actively averted their eyes, abandoning him instantly to save themselves. With a tight, furious jaw, Alistair snatched the pen, signed his name viciously across the bottom of the resignation letter, and shoved it back across the table. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He glared at Nora, his eyes burning with a hatred so deep it was almost tangible. "This isn't over, you little nobody. You think you can play at this level? You are going to drown." "Security will escort you out, Mr. Sterling," Nora replied quietly. Alistair turned and stormed out of the boardroom, the heavy oak doors slamming shut behind him, echoing like a thunderclap. Nora took a slow, deep breath, feeling her racing heart begin to settle. She looked around the table at the remaining board members. They were looking at her not with contempt, but with a cautious, profound fear. She had just publicly executed the heir apparent without raising her voice. "Now," Nora said, opening her laptop and bringing up a presentation slide, "if we are finished with the theatrics, let's discuss the third-quarter projections for the telecommunications sector. I believe we have ground to cover." Nora Hayes did not just survive her first 100 days as the CEO of Sterling Enterprises. She fundamentally rewired the conglomerate's DNA. The transition was brutal. The financial press, initially skeptical, watched in stunned silence as the former archivist dismantled the toxic corporate culture Alistair had cultivated. She fired 3 redundant vice presidents on her second day, brought in forensic auditors from PricewaterhouseCoopers to scrub every ledger, and shifted the company's real estate focus away from vanity skyscrapers in Hudson Yards toward high-yield, sustainable urban developments in emerging markets. By the time the snow began to fall over Manhattan that December, the stock of Sterling Enterprises had not only stabilized, it had surged by 14%. Wall Street analysts were calling her the Iron Ghost, a nod to her quiet demeanor and her ruthless efficiency. But while Nora was busy cementing her legacy in the glass-paneled boardrooms of Park Avenue, Alistair Sterling was drowning in the venom of his own exile. Stripped of his title, his non-voting shares, and his access to the corporate treasury, Alistair's glamorous life evaporated with terrifying speed. His platinum credit lines at Coutts and Chase were frozen as creditors panicked over his sudden unemployment and lack of liquidity. He was forced to vacate his sprawling Central Park penthouse and sublet a sterile, concrete loft in Soho. The elite circles of New York society, the patrons of the Knickerbocker Club and the VIPs at the Four Seasons, shut their doors to him. He was no longer a billionaire heir, he was a liability, a cautionary tale whispered about over dry martinis. Alistair spent his days drinking cheap scotch and obsessively tracking Nora's success on Bloomberg television. Every headline praising her strategic acquisitions felt like a physical blow to his ribs. He was not a man built for introspection, nor was he capable of accepting defeat. In his mind, the empire was stolen, and Nora was a master manipulator who had somehow brainwashed his uncle. Desperation breeds dangerous alliances. Unable to afford the aggressive litigators at Skadden or Wachtel, Lipton, Rosen, and Katz, Alistair turned to the shadows. Through a disgraced former hedge fund manager, he was introduced to Donovan Reed, a corporate fixer who specialized in extra-legal problem resolution for the ultra-wealthy. Reed was a former intelligence operative who operated a boutique security firm out of a nondescript office in Dumbo, Brooklyn. Alistair met Reed in a dimly lit steakhouse in Hell's Kitchen. He slid a thick manila envelope across the table. It contained the last of his liquid cash, $200,000. "I don't need her killed, Reed. I need her destroyed," Alistair rasped, his eyes bloodshot and frantic. Arthur was a paranoid old bastard. He kept a secondary safe in his private study at the Newport estate. I saw it once when I was a teenager. It's a floor safe, hidden beneath the Persian rug near the fireplace. I know my uncle. He wouldn't just leave everything to the maid without an insurance policy. There has to be something in that safe. A codicil, a hidden ledger, proof of her manipulation, or bearer bonds he kept off the books. I need you to get inside. Reed, a man with cold, slate-grey eyes and a face devoid of expression, weighed the envelope in his hands. "The Newport estate is a fortress, Mr. Sterling. Since Miss Hayes took over, she upgraded the security perimeter. Motion sensors, biometric locks on the archives, and a private detail rotating every 8 hours. That's why I'm paying you," Alistair snapped. "She is hosting the annual Sterling Philanthropy Gala at the Pierre Hotel this Friday. The entire executive board will be there. The house staff will be skeleton crew. That is your window." Reed pocketed the envelope. "I will get you what is in the safe. But whatever happens after that is your play. I don't do blackmail." "Just get me the leverage," Alistair said, a cruel, triumphant smile finally returning to his face. "I'll handle the execution." Friday evening arrived, bringing with it a bitter, howling nor'easter that battered the Rhode Island coastline. The Newport estate was shrouded in darkness, save for the perimeter security lights. While Nora was 180 miles away in Manhattan, standing under the crystal chandeliers of the Pierre Hotel in a breathtaking emerald gown, Donovan Reed was cutting through the estate's reinforced glass side door with a diamond-tipped thermal lance. The infiltration was flawless. Reed bypassed the laser grid in the main hallway and slipped into the cavernous library. The room smelled of old paper, polished mahogany, and the lingering scent of Arthur's pipe tobacco. Reed moved to the fireplace, rolled back the heavy Persian rug, and found the heavy steel plate flush with the floorboards. It took him 20 minutes to crack the biometric keypad using a cloned bypass terminal. With a heavy metallic thud, the safe unlocked. Inside, there was no stack of bearer bonds. There was no secret codicil reversing the will. There was only a single, heavy, leather-bound journal and a sealed envelope addressed, in Arthur Sterling's unmistakable scrawl, to Alistair. Reed took photos of the safe's interior, secured the journal and the envelope in a waterproof satchel, and vanished into the storm. At 3 a.m., in the sterile Soho loft, Reed dropped the items onto Alistair's glass coffee table. Alistair practically tore the envelope open. As he read the letter, his eyes widened, and a dark, hysterical laugh bubbled up from his chest. "I have her," Alistair whispered, his hands shaking with manic energy as he opened the leather journal. The pages were filled with Arthur's handwriting, detailing offshore accounts, shell companies, and illicit bribes paid to state senators for zoning permits dating back 20 years. But the twist, the beautiful, damning twist, was that Arthur had explicitly written that Nora Hayes was his primary accomplice in hiding these funds over the last 5 years. It was a masterclass in self-incrimination, perfectly framing the new CEO. He was losing his mind? Alistair laughed, pacing the floor. He documented his own crimes and tied her to them. If I leak this to the Department of Justice, she goes to federal prison for racketeering. The trust is invalidated due to criminal enterprise. And as the only blood relative, the estate reverts to me. He looked at Reed, his eyes shining with madness. "You just bought me back my kingdom." The following Tuesday, Sterling Enterprises was scheduled to host a highly publicized press conference at their Park Avenue headquarters to announce a landmark $3 billion merger with a European green energy telecom firm. It was Nora's crowning achievement, the deal that would permanently separate the company from its ruthless, cutthroat past. The main lobby was packed with financial journalists, cameras from CNBC and Bloomberg, and the entire board of directors. Benjamin Caldwell stood to the left of the podium, his posture rigid, while Harrison Cole conversed quietly with the head of public relations. At exactly 10 a.m., Nora stepped up to the podium. She projected absolute calm, her voice steady and authoritative, as she outlined the terms of the merger, her eyes scanning the sea of flashing cameras. Suddenly, a disturbance rippled through the back of the room. Security guards stepped forward. But it was too late. Alistair Sterling, flanked by 2 aggressive, heavily compensated lawyers from a boutique litigation firm, shoved his way to the front of the press pool. He looked entirely unhinged. His suit was slightly wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and his eyes burned with a feverish intensity. "Stop the cameras!" Alistair shouted, his voice echoing off the marble walls. "This merger is fraudulent. The CEO of this company is a criminal." A collective gasp swept through the lobby. The journalists immediately swiveled their cameras from Nora to Alistair. Flashbulbs erupted like a strobe light. Harrison Cole stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "Security, remove this man immediately. He has a restraining order barring him from this property." "Don't touch me," Alistair snarled, holding up the leather-bound journal high above his head for the cameras to see. "This is the personal ledger of Arthur Sterling. I retrieved it from his private safe. It contains irrefutable proof of a 2-decade-long racketeering operation, massive tax evasion, and political bribery." He pointed a shaking finger directly at Nora, who stood completely motionless at the podium. And this woman, this thief, was his primary accomplice. She helped him launder the money for the last 5 years. She isn't a visionary. She's a glorified mob boss. I have already submitted copies of this ledger to the FBI and the Securities and Exchange Commission. The lobby erupted into absolute chaos. Reporters began shouting questions all at once. The board members exchanged terrified glances. If what Alistair was saying was true, the stock would plummet to 0 before the closing bell. Alistair smirked, breathing heavily, savouring the absolute destruction he was raining down upon her. "It's over, Nora. You're going to prison, and I am taking my company back." Nora did not panic. She did not call for security. Instead, she slowly leaned toward the microphone. "Are you quite finished, Alistair?" she asked. Her voice was barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the screaming lobby like a scalpel. Alistair frowned, his smirk faltering. "You have nothing to say. The evidence is right here." Nora stepped out from behind the podium. She walked slowly down the short flight of stairs, closing the distance between herself and the disgraced heir until she was standing just 3 feet away from him. The cameras clicked frantically. "Benjamin," Nora said, not taking her eyes off Alistair. "Would you please explain to Alistair what he is holding?" Benjamin Caldwell stepped forward, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He did not look panicked. He looked profoundly bored. "Mr. Sterling," Caldwell began, his dry voice carrying effortlessly. "The journal you are holding is indeed written in your uncle's handwriting. However, it is not a ledger of Arthur's crimes. It is a work of fiction. A prop." Alistair froze. "You're lying. I read it. The dates, the account numbers." "The account numbers are routing codes for charitable donations to the ASPCA," Caldwell interrupted smoothly. "The names of the supposedly bribed state senators are actually anagrams of characters from Arthur's favorite Charles Dickens novels. The entire journal was drafted by Arthur, witnessed by myself, and placed in that safe strictly as bait." The blood drained from Alistair's face. "Bait? That's insane. Why would he—" "Because Arthur knew exactly who you were, Alistair," Nora said, her voice turning cold and sharp. "He knew that if you were backed into a corner, you wouldn't accept defeat with grace. He knew you would try to cheat. He knew you would hire someone to break into the Newport estate to find a way to destroy me." "It's a trap," Alistair whispered, stumbling backward, the journal suddenly feeling like a block of lead in his hand. "It is indeed," Nora confirmed. "You see, Arthur also had the pages of that journal lightly dusted with a microscopic, chemically traceable isotopic powder. A powder that is currently on your hands, your suit, and undoubtedly all over your apartment." She gestured toward the back of the lobby. "Furthermore, the safe you had your operative break into was legally designated as a federally protected repository for the Sterling Trust. Breaking into it is not a simple trespassing charge. It is a Class B federal felony." As if on cue, the heavy glass doors of the lobby swung open. 4 men wearing windbreakers with the letters FBI printed in bold yellow across the back walked into the room, led by a stern-faced special agent. Alistair looked wildly around the room, realizing the trap had snapped shut with bone-crushing finality. His hired lawyers, realizing the magnitude of the disaster they had just walked into, quietly stepped away from him, disappearing into the crowd of journalists. "Alistair Sterling," the lead FBI agent said, stepping forward and flashing his badge. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit corporate espionage, federal burglary, and extortion. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Alistair didn't fight. He was paralyzed by the sheer, terrifying brilliance of the dead man who had outplayed him from beyond the grave, and the quiet woman who had executed the final checkmate flawlessly. As the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, he looked at Nora one last time. She wasn't looking at him with pity, nor was she gloating. She simply looked at him, the way one looks at a weed that has finally been pulled from a beautiful garden. "Take him out through the side entrance," Nora instructed the agents calmly. "We have a merger to announce." As the agents led a broken, silent Alistair out of the building, the flashes of the cameras intensified. Nora turned back, walked up the stairs and took her place behind the podium. She smoothed the lapels of her suit, looked out at the room of stunned journalists and relieved executives, and commanded the room once more. She was no longer the invisible archivist. She was the undisputed titan of the Sterling Empire. The story of Nora Hayes and Alistair Sterling serves as a brutal masterclass in the dangers of arrogance and the quiet power of observation. Arthur Sterling's final act wasn't just about transferring wealth, it was about ensuring his legacy survived the rot of entitlement. Alistair's tragic flaw was his absolute conviction that worth is determined by volume, aggressive posturing, and pedigree. He failed to see that the most dangerous piece on the board is often the one standing quietly in the corner, learning the rules of the game while everyone else is busy shouting. Nora's triumph reminds us that true power does not need to announce itself. It operates with patience, integrity, and a willingness to let one's enemies orchestrate their own spectacular downfalls. In the end, the Invisible Woman inherited the earth, while the Golden Boy was left with nothing but shadows.